Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about sight reading and mostly about different, I guess, types of sight reading or ways of sight reading. And I think that misunderstanding these is why there's so much bad advice about sight reading, in my opinion. Uh, so off the top, the, it's important to understand that there is a difference between practicing sight reading and performing sight reading. And then I guess sort of another thing would be just sight reading, sort of in a casual way. So let me sort of explain what I'm thinking about here. Um, when I am playing at like a rehearsal and somebody has just handed me music and I need to play for a choir or whatever, I have to keep time going. That is the most important thing. The notes are secondary, but I have to keep time going. So that's where the whole just keep going thing comes from. And often you'll hear that advice, and I think it's kind of terrible advice for practicing sight reading, but you hear it from people who are already pretty good sight readers. And I think they have a misunderstanding of certain things, which I'll get to more later, maybe. Um, but that's sort of a performative sight reading. There are also times I'll be handed music and literally be performing it in real time. During the performance, obviously, I just have to keep going. Um, but if I'm practicing sight reading, I don't do that. When I'm practicing sight reading, I'm reading much slower. I'm always keeping my brain ahead of my fingers as long as uh, I should be doing that. It's one of these things where you get kind of lazy because practice is hard. That sort of practice and focus is hard for an extended period of time. But I'm trying to always keep my brain ahead of my fingers. I'm reading slowly enough that I can digest what's in front of me. I'm very actively thinking about reading ahead. Um, I read at a variable tempo, which basically means if I'm reading and I run into a situation where because I'm reading ahead, I see like a bunch of 16th notes, or I recognize, oh, there's some rhythmic pattern that I probably cannot play at tempo. I will start to like slow down and retard into that section so that I can play it accurately without just full stopping. I find a sort of musical way, as musical as I can, to just slow into that and then play it accurately. Because, I could be playing music and it's full of half notes and quarter notes, and that's really easy for me to read at a brisk tempo, but when there's suddenly a lot of density, maybe I can't sight read that well enough. So in those cases, I'll slow down into that section, play it accurately, and then speed back up. Obviously, I'm not playing um, in perfect time. I'm aware of perfect time. I'm aware of where all the vertical alignments of the subdivisions of the rhythms are happening, and I'm making sure that those happen. But when I'm practicing by myself to get better at sight reading, uh, I'm not performing for anybody. It's not a performative sight reading. Um, so time is not important. Accuracy is important because I don't know. I try to make this analogy because everything about music really just relates to speech or language and learning how to do that. When children are learning to read, uh, unless they're using one of those kind of really dumb methods I recently heard about. Man, there's this podcast, Super Side Tangent, Sold a Story. You should listen to that to hear about some infuriating things about how pseudoscience got into reading education. But anyway, when we're teaching people to read properly, you wouldn't tell them to just, okay, here's a metronome. You have to say a certain number of syllables per second or something, right? Or per beat. You wouldn't tell them to just keep going. You tell kids to sound out words, because if you gloss over that word every time, did you ever learn that word? Did you learn how to pronounce it? The next time you see that word, will you be able to pronounce it any better? Will you be able to read it any better? No, you get better at reading those words by you slow down the pace of your reading when you get to it, and you make sure that you can sound it out. Otherwise, you just never learn it. And that's the same thing with sight reading. is if you run into a thing where, oh, I can't read this at this tempo, well, just blazing past it and simplifying it on the spot, which is what I would do in a performance situation, that's not helping me get better at accurately doing that in real time, long term. Um, and the way to get there is that you have to slow down, do that variable tempo reading, and read it accurately. You're making your brain do the hard work of working through that thing. And just because you're reading it slow now doesn't mean that you won't be able to read it fast later. Just like children learning to read, they might be agonizingly struggling through a word that to you is obviously really easy to read, but there would have been a time when that was maybe a hard word for you to read and you just don't remember it. So you eventually get to where you recognize the rhythmic composites and different chord shapes and whatever else on the page, so that you can chunk that information together faster. So when you see similar things in the future, you're just incrementally faster at processing that. And that's always the thing with reading. It's a high volume thing. You just have to do a lot of it. And that every time that you encounter that problem, your brain is just, microseconds faster at doing that thing, at it going from, what is this, to I'm just playing it. And eventually you're not thinking about it really at all. So that's a really important thing that I think people miss when they say just keep going, because you're not really practicing sight reading in that way. I would also say there's sort of another, just like casual sight reading. I was doing a lot of this recently where I was trying to read through a lot of material, specifically to pick some music for some gigs, where I'm actually in charge of picking the music. And so I was just reading through a lot of these like gospel hymn arrangement books, and I was just reading them to kind of get a feel, like, what does this sound like? What do I like this arrangement? And there are sections I can play at tempo and sections I can't. But I'm trying to get a feel for it. So I was doing sort of in between, where I was mostly accurate, but I wasn't 100% accurate, and I didn't want to do that very deliberate variable tempo thing where I get it 100% accurate, because I'm aiming at that point just to get an idea of how it sounds. I don't think that is a good way to practice sight reading. It's sort of sloppy. It's good for just hearing how something new sounds, and in my case I was able to read a couple of dozen of those and get an idea of which ones I want to actually work up and use for that gig. But that did not make me any better at the spots that I was having trouble reading. I would actually need to, for one, in the cases of that, most of the time, because I talked about this in the 3 bottlenecks of sight reading, most of the time it was either a technical limitation or is a reading limitation that was causing me problems. So really, for a lot of that stuff, it's mostly I just need to solve those technical hurdles and stuff like that. And then eventually, at some point, I will be at a point where that stuff is sight readable very accurately and closer to tempo. So those are kind of the 3 big ones, the practice sight reading versus performative sight reading, and then just kind of casual reading. Because, that's the way that you might read a book. I'm sure you've been reading, just especially a fiction book just for fun. And, you're in kind of a dry section and you're sort of skimming. You're getting the gist of the story, but you're not really thinking about every word. You're not lingering on a lot of stuff. You're just trying to get through the plot. So it's a very different thing. So those are those 3 sort of different types of sight reading. I should probably stop here, but I can't help myself. So I want to talk about something else related to all of that, because there's what I would call active reading. I don't really know what to call it, and it's something I think people don't think about very much. This is when you have practiced something, you probably know it pretty well. In some cases, you might even have it memorized, but you keep reading it off the page. Doing that helps cement the associations you have between what your hands are doing and what that looks like on the page. as a very tangentially related part of that, I spent years playing in like bands where I was just comping from chords, and I did lots of technical exercises for chord stuff, but I did very little reading at that time. And I remember there being times where I would be looking at something on a page and I would be struggling to read it because this was totally the reading bottleneck was the whole thing then. And I would find a chord that I was very familiar with in my hands and I would be like, "Oh, that's what that looks like on the page." Like it's such a bizarre thing, but that's kind of how that works. I did not have like I had super great technical control of it, but I did not have a good strong association between like what that looks like on the page where I see that and I immediately know what that means. It's like if you saw the word tree in a foreign language and you could see it and you're like, well, I know what a tree is and I know the word tree in English, but you're seeing this thing and you go, oh, is that how you write tree? Is that what that means in that language? You haven't connected all those dots. And, when you're dealing with large vocabulary, it's really easy to forget little pieces of vocabulary. And that's how music works. There's lots of vocabulary. So introducing a little bit at a time and using a lot of that so that it sticks and then slowly adding vocabulary is how you fix that. But you need to do a lot of active sight reading when you're playing stuff. So inevitably, you are going to play things. I don't recommend playing so much stuff that you end up, if you're memorizing by osmosis, I don't think that's the most efficient way. It's kind of a red flag. If you haven't memorized before you can play it, that is a red flag. But you are just going to memorize at least portions of things. I still do it because, a lot of times I'm being hired to play things where there are sections that are just really hard for me. And so I will do a lot of work on those sections. I end up memorizing, 2 or 3 bars here and there just through the pure osmosis of I have practiced this too many times. But I am still actively reading that off the page. So I'm creating those associations. I was even doing some really dry technical stuff the other day and making a point of reading it on the page because, it was boogie woogie and rock style stuff, which is really repetitive. But I'm not used to looking at those patterns on the page and playing them. And even though it was just like repetitive technical stuff, I was still seeing things written in certain voicings and certain ranges on the staff that I'm not used to reading notes in. And especially like in strange keys. I really noticed how much there was a reading deficit there. Like I could play these patterns in every key and I feel them really well. But man, when I'm suddenly reading something and it's like, there's lots of C flats in here, or something where there are inharmonics to certain things. I'm used to thinking about it in like G sharp and it's written in A flat, that kind of stuff. Reading it off the page forces me to make the correct associations so that I could read it either way. So it's really important to keep actively reading when you're playing stuff that you already know. That does help towards your sight reading. It really reinforces things. However, that cannot be your entire diet for your sight reading. If you really want to advance your sight reading, you have to actually be reading like new music for the very first time and making your brain really do that work. And that usually means working on stuff that is way, 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 way easier. I still... partially as a review of these materials because I like looking at different books and seeing what resources are out there, but I still find it useful. I'll be working through level, grade 1 and 2 books. I still find value in those. There are spots that I'm like, oh, this is helpful. And it's not so overwhelming. It's a tiny hurdle, but, I'm always finding things. There's meat there for me to learn things. And I always tell people, if you think something's too easy, put your hands on the keys and prove it. Especially people coming from other instruments think, well, I'm already this good, I can just skip that. And that was the mistake I made for years. You just need to prove it, and you need to always drop the ego and pick up a book, whatever beginner method book, and if you think you're beyond it, pick that book up and read through it. Um, unless you can read everything in there just super perfectly. Sight read it with all the musical elements involved, great phrasing, dynamics, articulation, and it's effortless. Unless you can do that and sight read it perfectly, there's something for you to gain from that. And I think people don't realize how much there is to gain, and so they skip over that stuff. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the terraced structure in sight reading. I was actually talking about this on Reddit recently, and thinking about how this works. there, especially, it's something I've noticed when I'm reading through graded material. If I read a lot of graded material in a row, because like I got along, it's been a while back, but I got all those Keith Snell books, which I think are actually a really good resource for sight reading. And so I just started reading through them like in series. I would read a certain amount every day, and try to not just absolutely poop sock the whole thing. But, I would read very large portions of those, but I was reading them all kind of in a row up through the graded material. And what I really noticed was there became a point where certain details would fall away, in the sight reading process. So for the earlier books, any dynamics, any articulations, any of that on the page, I'm good. I'm playing all the right notes. I've got all the articulations. It's all good. But as I kept going, sometimes I would be able to retain those, but I would have to slow down to get all those things in. So like my mental bandwidth was starting to get to a point where I couldn't process fast enough to get all of the notes and all of the musical stuff, dynamics, articulations, phrasing, dynamics, etc., whatever. Um, and then as I would keep going, I started to reach a point where it's like, okay, I can only worry about getting the notes and rhythms right. At this point, I'm still being able to play, but it's slowly, it's consistent, but it's slow, and I'm losing a lot of those details. And if I would keep pushing it, eventually I'm getting into that very highly variable tempo thing. Things don't feel none of the musical elements are there. Everything starts to fall apart, right? I'm still able to play accurately, and that's the thing is you can read things that are really, really hard and use them. Okay, if you have a lot of experience as a reader, as a sight reader, you can read things that are really hard and get some value out of them. I don't think it's the maximum amount of value, but you can get some value by just deliberately being slow, reading at a variable tempo, thinking about accuracy, thinking about reading ahead, really thinking about all of the elements involved, the rhythmic reading, rhythmic composite, vertical alignment, all that kind of crap. You can get something out of that, but it is so fucking taxing to read that stuff. It's exhausting, and it will just mentally fatigue you. And I think it stops being worth it, because what you can get out of it is just not worth the effort you're putting into it. It's very similar, in that way, it's very similar to like lifting weights. Like there becomes a point where you're getting less results because you're lifting such heavy weights for such low reps. And if your goal is to like build muscle and not to practice powerlifting, you're not getting a very good return on investment. And you're so exhausted and you've trained so hard that you're not recovered the next day. You can't do more. And that will totally happen if you read that hard. And when I'm working on stuff, especially if I get a stack of new music for a gig, and I know that I have a limited amount of time, I have got to burn the candle at both ends, and I just have to digest, get a once-over of everything, but it could be dozens of pages, and some of it can be really dense, and I will almost have like a mental hangover the next day because it was so taxing, and I don't think it's worth it. And so, I've gotten to where sometimes I will just do that sort of casual reading rather than very deliberate reading on those things, so I have an idea of where the rough spots are. Because if you're really doing serious like practice sight reading, it's exhausting. And so working on really high level material, now you're dropping out all the elements too. It's too hard. but you can get something out of that. So what I'm getting at is that you should take a sort of terrorist approach here. You can still read some of that stuff. Just remember that you are practicing sight reading, not performing it. So be accurate. But then if you're reading a little bit of that, make sure it's just a little bit. And then read more material that you can read at a mostly consistent tempo. Maybe it doesn't have all of the elements involved, but that's good too. But then also read a couple of levels below that. Read some stuff where you can read it with everything. You can read it at a good tempo with all the musical elements involved, because that is a whole other thing when you eventually get to where reading all of the notes isn't hard and all the rhythms aren't hard, for the very low level material, because you've progressed to much more difficult material, and you can read it somewhat accurately. Now you can go back to that stuff and you have enough extra mental bandwidth that, okay, these notes are super easy, these rhythms are super easy, and on the first read you can think, oh, I really need to make this crescendo happen, and oh, I've got these very specific articulations that give it this style, and I have all these phrase markings, and these things need to be legato and connected. Then you can start paying attention to that stuff, but that's another skill. It's a much higher level skill for sight reading. You need to make sure you have the notes first, and the rhythms first. But if you really want to advance and it not sound so dry and robotic and terrible when you're sight reading, once you get to a certain level, you do need to be looking at that really low level material and making sure that you can practice sight reading with all of the musical elements intact. I think that is also a thing that some people can overlook. It's what makes some people just sound incredible as sight readers. Not me, some of my peers who are just incredible, because yeah, there are people who read okay, but it sounds really robotic. And then I have peers who can sight read moderately difficult to even very difficult stuff, and it just sounds amazing. It is basically performance ready, at least to lay listeners. And so it's because they are incorporating all of those elements on the first read. And on some of my other instruments where I have more experience, or monophonic instruments where I'm only reading one note at a time, which is much less cognitively challenging, I'm able to put in all those things. I sight read casually with my wife all the time. This isn't good sight reading practice, but we'll sight read duets. She'll be on whatever woodwind instrument, and I'll be on like trumpet or iwi or something like that. And yeah, we are reading with all of those elements. We're putting in all of the ornaments to music, and we are definitely putting in sometimes even extra ornaments that aren't there if we're reading classical and Baroque styles. And we're able to put in all the stylistic articulation matching together, and that makes it sound really good on the first read. So, I get a certain amount of reading practice out of that, but it's not the best reading practice, because I'm not really stopping to fix things because we're working together. But yeah, you can make things sound really musical when you can sight read with all those elements intact. So keep that in mind with that terrorist reading, that you don't want everything to be the hardest stuff, but you can read that to not be entirely bored. You just need to be at a high enough level that you can read comfortably at a variable tempo and know how to work on accuracy and maintain that above other things. And also, the other thing I didn't mention about this, reading really high level stuff, your proprioception probably will not be up to snuff, and you will spend a lot more time looking up and down. And then when you're reading at a really slow tempo, it's easier for you to get away with it, and you don't notice that you're glancing your hands more than usual. That's another thing. When you're reading really easy material, you might not even notice that you don't have to look at your hands, because once you've hit a certain level, you have progressed to a point where your proprioception had to develop to get to this higher level. And so when you read easier material, if you won't even realize it, it's this thing where you're like reading and you have to think, oh wait, I'm not even having to look at my hands. No wonder I can look ahead so much better. So let's talk about reading with my wife, sight reading duets just for fun. And that casual sight reading it's something that I think a lot of readers do. Once they get to a certain level, this is how they read. And it's okay, but that is maintenance. That will maintain your reading at the level that it's at. I don't think it really develops your reading much further. And I have some peers, I have one peer in particular that I always think of when it comes to this. Um, and he's a fantastic jazz pianist too. So he improvises really well. He understands the theory stuff, so he can fake things really well. And he's a good reader. So he sight reads pretty well, but there are things he doesn't sight read quite as well. He also glances at his hands a lot, because for most of what he's reading, he reads ahead well enough that he can just kind of chunk a whole bunch of stuff in and look at his hands. It's not moving too fast. It's not too dense. But if it's going really fast, he runs into problems and he can't glance at his hands. But he's got the theory skills, so he is able to simplify really well pretty quickly. But every once in a while, he runs into something where it's like, okay, you can't get away with faking this. It has to be played exactly as it is on the page. And it's a rhythm that's slightly out of your wheelhouse, and it's musically dense, and it has big leaps. And he actually has not specifically trained his proprioception for those leaps, because he's playing in jazz styles where he has it memorized. I made a video about this a long time ago. He has it memorized in that way that people in pop and jazz do, where he knows how it goes, and he has the theory knowledge to know how it goes. That means he could play a familiar tune in any key because he just knows, he has the ear and the theory skills to make that happen. So he has it memorized in that sense. He knows the chord changes by ear, and he knows the melody by ear. But anyway, because of that, so much of his jazz playing, he doesn't have any music in front of him. And so he can look at his hands pretty much all the time. And because of that, he hasn't really had to train that proprioception. But it has caught up to him occasionally. Not enough to cause a problem, usually. Sometimes for the people working with him, it can cause a problem. There have been issues. But he gets away with it. It's close enough. And that's because he basically just, he's reading everything very casually. He's simplifying a lot, because that's what you do in a performative sight reading situation. But he no longer practices sight reading. He's not even trying to fix those weaknesses in his sight reading, because it's close enough for all the work he does. And I think a lot of the people who give sight reading advice tend to be people who are already very good sight readers, and they don't remember a time when they weren't. And so that's why they have the advice like, just keep going. But I think most of their reading is not practice sight reading. It's this casual sight reading, which just maintains their reading at the level they're already at. And if that level is already pretty good, it's close enough. So keep that in mind. Just like think about all these things and see how they apply to how you are, how you're practicing your sight reading. Are you just casually reading because you're a pretty decent reader, so you're not 100% playing accurately? You're playing mostly accurately, and you're kind of faking through certain things, but you're not fixing them. Or are you practicing where it's very slow, very deliberate, variable tempo, and you're making sure accuracy is the most important thing? And especially don't be doing the performative sight reading. Make sure you're keeping up with your active reading, so that whenever you're working on music you may or may not have memorized or you are familiar with, keep your eyes on the page anyway, because following along and creating those associations is really important for your reading overall. So those are just some things to think about, and see how that applies to your reading. Hopefully any of that was helpful, just incoherent rambling, but okay.